They told me, "Don't talk to her at the funeral, she'll make a scene." That was the first thing I heard as I stepped out of the car and onto the gravel drive outside the church. The voice was hushed but sharp, cutting through the low murmur of arriving guests. I didn't turn to see who said it. I didn't need to. That tone, the quick, darting warning masked as concern, was familiar. It had threaded itself through my life in so many small moments, always meant for me to hear, but never addressed directly. The air smelled faintly of rain and lilies, a cloying sweetness that sat uneasily on my tongue. The sky was a dull pewter, pressing down on everything. My shoes crunched over the stones, slow, deliberate steps, not because I was afraid, but because my legs felt heavier than they should. Every movement today felt like lifting something wet and unwieldy. Inside, the light was softer, but the hush was heavier. People moved with the restrained choreography of grief, heads bent, eyes flitting quickly away if they met mine. I could feel the space they made around me, just enough to be polite, just enough to keep me out. And there, at the front, the first row, the row that, by tradition, belonged to family, sat 3 empty seats. My eyes fixed on them. I knew they had been left open for them. The ones who were running late. The ones who always ran late and yet never heard about it, because lateness from certain people was charming, forgivable, even expected. But I didn't stop. My hand tightened around my small black clutch, and I walked straight up the aisle. I could feel every pair of eyes tracking me, their gaze brushing against my shoulders, some sharp, some weary, some just curious. My heart pounded, not fast, but heavy, like it had grown roots that tangled through my chest. When I reached the first seat on the left, I pulled it out and sat. My knees touched the pew in front of me, the wood cold even through my stockings. I didn't look back. I didn't need to see the faces. I had already imagined them, the pursed lips, the arched brows, the silent exchange of looks that said, "She's doing it again." But here's the thing they never understood: I wasn't doing anything. I was just being where I was supposed to be. Where I had the right to be. The only reason it looked like defiance was because they had built an entire world around the idea that I didn't belong. I could see the coffin from here. The polished wood, the neat arrangement of white roses, the photograph propped up beside it, the one I had taken, though no one would ever mention that. In it, he was laughing at something I'd said. I could still hear the sound, warm and unrestrained. It was the sound that had once made me feel like home was a person, not a place. And now he was gone. The priest began speaking, his voice deep and steady, but the words washed over me like water on glass. I heard nothing except the echo of that morning in my kitchen, when the call came. The way my hand had trembled so violently I had to put the cup of tea down before it spilled. The way my breath had caught, and then, nothing. Just a strange, ringing stillness, as if the world had pulled all sound into itself. I felt a shift beside me. Someone had taken the seat to my right. The faint scent of expensive perfume and cold air drifted toward me. I didn't look, not yet, but I knew it was her. My cousin. The one who had delivered that little instruction at the door, or maybe just passed it along. She sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, the kind of composure that felt like a performance. I could sense her side-eye flick toward me, measuring whether I would follow the unspoken rules. I didn't. Because this wasn't about her. It wasn't about them. It was about him, the man in the coffin, the one who had taught me to ride a bike, who had stayed up with me when I had nightmares, who had, once upon a time, promised that no matter what storms came, I'd never be left standing alone. And yet, somewhere between then and now, he had been pulled away from me, not by choice, but by a slow erosion. They had whispered things. Rearranged truths. Made gatherings into private affairs I heard about afterward. Every time, I told myself it wasn't worth a fight. Every time, I let the tide push me back a little further. Until now. The service went on, voices rising and falling, people standing and sitting. I moved when I had to, but my mind was elsewhere, moving through old rooms, old summers, old winters. There was a memory that kept pressing forward, a day when I was 8, sitting on the back steps with him. He had just fixed the chain on my bike, grease still on his hands. I'd asked him if he thought families could stop loving each other. He had looked at me with such surprise and said, "Not the real kind of love. That never stops." I had believed him then. Now, I wasn't sure. At the end of the service, when people began lining up to pay their respects at the coffin, I stayed in my seat. I knew they expected me to wait until last. That was how they wanted it, my grief contained, quiet, almost invisible. Instead, I stood when the aisle cleared and walked forward, feeling the shift in the air behind me. At the coffin, I rested my hand lightly on the polished wood. For a moment, I thought my knees might give way, but I steadied myself. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't breaking, but because I didn't want them to think my tears were some performance for their judgment. I leaned closer, just enough that no one else could hear, and whispered, "I'm here. I'm still here." And in that moment, it didn't matter who approved, who whispered, who turned away. Because this, my place at the front, my words, my presence, wasn't for them. It was for him. It was for me. After I whispered to him, I stepped back, slow, my hand lingering on the wood until my fingertips slid away. The line behind me inched forward, the shuffling of shoes and rustling of coats filling the space between the organ's low, sustained notes. I kept my chin up, though every instinct told me to drop my gaze, to make myself smaller. It's strange how you can be a grown woman, decades past childhood, and still feel like you're 10 years old in the presence of certain people, the ones who have decided who you are and won't allow you to be anything else. As I turned to walk back toward my seat, I caught sight of her again, my cousin, the one who had slipped in beside me earlier. Her eyes darted from me to the man standing next to her, some distant uncle or perhaps just her husband, and I could see the faint smirk in the corner of her mouth. Not mocking, exactly. It was worse than that. It was the look of someone certain they'd already won. I sat again, still in that first seat. I didn't move over for the others when they finally arrived late, their coats still carrying the smell of cigarette smoke and damp wool. They hesitated in the aisle, as if deciding whether to make a scene, then chose the row behind me instead. I didn't turn around. I didn't offer them the satisfaction of a glance. The service ended. The organ faded. People began filing out, voices low but swelling in little pockets of conversation. I heard my name a few times in that particular way, said as if it were the start of a sentence best finished elsewhere. I stayed seated until the aisle was mostly clear, then stood and walked toward the side exit. The main doors would have been faster, but I wasn't in the mood to be intercepted. Outside, the cold hit me first, a damp, clinging cold that seemed to sink straight into my bones. The air carried the scent of wet earth and the faint metallic tang of the nearby river. I pulled my coat tighter, tucking my hands into my sleeves, and headed toward the gravel path that led around the side of the church to the small parking lot. I thought I might make it to my car without incident. But I should have known better. Was that really necessary? The voice came from behind me, closer than I expected. I stopped, my breath clouding in the air. When I turned, it was her again. The cousin. She was holding her clutch in one hand, the other stuffed into her coat pocket, her eyes sharp and bright. What was? I asked, though I already knew where this was going. Sitting there. In the first seat. You know they wanted it for. She stopped herself, glanced around to make sure we were alone enough, then lowered her voice. You made people uncomfortable. I let the words hang there, tasting them like something bitter. Do you think I came here to make anyone comfortable? I asked quietly. Do you think that's what this day is about for me? Her lips pressed into a thin line. It's about respect. Yes, I said. It is. And I respected him enough to sit where I should have sat years ago. The flicker in her eyes told me I'd hit something she didn't want to acknowledge. She recovered quickly, rolling her shoulders. You know, if you didn't always push. I cut her off. If I didn't always push, I'd be halfway down the street right now, waiting for someone to tell me it's okay to come in. My voice was calm, but I could feel the tremor in my hands, hidden in my sleeves. Not today. She didn't respond. Just gave me a look that was part irritation, part something else. Maybe confusion. Maybe even the faintest glimmer of respect, though she'd never admit it. Then she turned and walked back toward the main doors, her heels crunching on the gravel. I stood there for a long moment after she left, the cold air biting at my cheeks. My heart was still thudding, but slower now, as if it had accepted that the worst of the storm had passed. I walked to my car, the old silver hatchback that I'd driven for nearly a decade, and slid into the driver's seat. The upholstery smelled faintly of pine from the air freshener I'd bought last month. I started the engine but didn't pull out right away. Instead, I sat there, watching the others file out into the parking lot. Little clusters formed, people hugging, shaking hands, leaning in close to murmur things they wouldn't want overheard. I recognized most of them. People I'd grown up around, whose faces I knew better than I wanted to. Some glanced my way, then quickly looked elsewhere. A few didn't bother to hide it, their eyes lingering with that mix of curiosity and judgment that feels like a weight on your skin. I drove away slowly, the tires crunching on the gravel, then humming on the wet asphalt. The road from the church wound past the cemetery, where a cluster of workers stood beside a freshly dug plot, shovels in hand, waiting for the mourners to clear. I wondered if they noticed the way the family split into little islands, each avoiding the others. Back at my house, the quiet was heavy. I took off my coat and draped it over the back of a chair, then went straight to the kitchen. My hands went on autopilot, filling the kettle, setting it on the stove, pulling down the tin of tea leaves. The small motions grounded me. I found myself staring at the steam as it curled upward, thinking about the last time he'd been in this kitchen. It had been 3 years ago. He'd come by unannounced, something he'd always done before the drift started. He'd sat at the same table, tapping his fingers against the wood, telling me about a fishing trip he was planning with the boys. "You should come," he'd said, half teasing, knowing I hated fishing. But it wasn't about fishing. It was about being there. About not letting the space between us widen. I'd told him I couldn't that weekend, work, obligations, the usual excuses. I'd thought there'd be another time. There hadn't been. I poured the tea and sat at the table, wrapping my hands around the mug for warmth. The quiet stretched on. Somewhere outside, a car passed, its tires hissing on the wet road. I thought about calling someone, an old friend, maybe, but the thought of explaining the day from the beginning felt exhausting. Instead, I pulled the old photo album from the shelf in the living room. The spine was worn, the edges fraying. I flipped through the pages, past birthdays and picnics, past Christmas mornings and summer evenings. There he was, in a dozen different moments, always with that same easy smile. But as the years went on, the photos with me in them grew fewer. By the last section, there were none. It wasn't sudden. It had been a slow fade, like the way colors drain from a photograph left in the sun. I closed the album and sat there, staring at the cover. The house felt too still, too empty. My tea had gone cold. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening to the faint creaks of the house settling, to the wind brushing against the windows. My mind kept replaying the day, the walk up the aisle, the weight of eyes on me, the whispered warning at the door. Part of me felt raw, exposed. Another part felt steady, in a way I hadn't expected. Like I'd put something back in place that had been off-kilter for a long time. In the dark, I remembered something else he'd once told me, years ago, when I was younger and still learning how to hold my own. We'd been sitting outside at dusk, the air heavy with the smell of cut grass. I'd been upset about some fight with a friend, convinced I'd done something wrong just by standing my ground. He'd looked at me and said, "If you spend your whole life making sure no one's upset with you, you'll never live it. People can survive being uncomfortable." I realized, lying there, that I had spent so many years proving him wrong, shrinking myself, smoothing over edges, letting things go to keep the peace. And all it had done was make me vanish in the spaces where I should have been solid. But not today. And maybe that was why, despite the ache in my chest, I finally drifted off to sleep, because for the first time in a long time, I hadn't stepped aside. The morning after the funeral, I woke to the sound of rain tapping against the window. Not the heavy, insistent kind that demands attention, but the slow, steady drizzle that seeps into the day without hurry. For a moment, lying there, I felt the pull to stay in bed, to let the hours drift past without shape. But the truth was, my mind was already awake, already circling the same thoughts I'd fallen asleep with, the faces, the whispers, the way the air in the church had felt both sacred and suffocating. I sat up, the blanket pooling in my lap, and looked around the room. Everything was where it always was, the books on the nightstand, the old lamp with the crooked shade, the framed photo on the dresser. That photo had been taken years ago, at a family gathering back when I still thought gatherings were about being together rather than being positioned. He was in the background, laughing at something out of frame, his hand resting casually on my shoulder. I could almost feel the warmth of it still. I made tea, the same way I always did, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it tasted different, thinner, somehow, though I knew that was just the taste of absence. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the steam until it thinned and disappeared, wishing I could do the same with the knot in my chest. By mid-morning, the rain had let up enough to leave the streets slick and shining. I pulled on my coat and decided to walk to the small grocery store a few blocks away. I didn't need much, just bread, maybe some milk, but I needed to move. The air was cool, damp, carrying the smell of wet leaves and something faintly metallic from the gutters. My shoes clicked against the pavement in a rhythm that steadied me. At the store, I kept my head down, focusing on the shelves, on the neat rows of jars and boxes. But I still heard my name, spoken softly in the next aisle. I didn't turn right away. When I did, I saw Mrs. Callahan, an old neighbor from years ago. She gave me that look, half sympathy, half curiosity. "I heard about the funeral," she said, her voice lowered like we were sharing a secret. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," I said, managing a small smile. There was a pause, the kind that invites more, and I could feel her trying to decide if she should mention whatever she'd heard about my presence there. I didn't give her the chance. I excused myself politely and moved to the checkout. I wasn't ready to start rehearsing the events for anyone else's consumption. Back home, the afternoon stretched ahead of me, quiet but heavy. I tried reading, but the words slipped past me. I tried folding laundry, but I found myself staring out the window instead, watching a pair of sparrows pick at the wet grass. Eventually, I gave up on pretending to be productive and just let myself sit with it all. What I kept circling back to was the feeling in the church when I'd walked up that aisle. The way my heart had thudded in my chest, the heat rising in my face, the certainty that I would be judged for it, and the deeper certainty that I didn't care, not this time. It was strange, how something so small in the grand scheme, a seat, just a piece of wooden cushion, could feel like claiming a piece of my own history. But it wasn't just about that day. It was about all the days before it, the countless moments when I'd been edged out, told without words that my place was elsewhere. And how I'd let it happen, telling myself it was easier not to fight. Maybe it was, for a while. But the cost had been slow and quiet and constant, until I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to choose for myself. By late afternoon, I found myself pulling out the box from the back of the closet. It was an old cardboard thing, taped at the corners, with his handwriting on the side from when he'd helped me move years ago. Inside were bits and pieces, postcards he'd sent me from trips, a scarf he'd bought me one winter, ticket stubs from a concert we'd gone to. There was even a folded paper napkin with a joke scribbled on it in pen, one he'd told me at a cafe when I was in one of my worst moods, just to make me laugh. I sat on the floor with the box in front of me, running my hands over each item like they were touchstones. They were small things, ordinary in themselves, but together they felt like a map, a record of a connection that had been real, no matter how the later years had gone. I don't know how long I sat there before the phone rang. The sound startled me enough that I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick it up. It was my aunt, his sister. Her voice was flat, polite, but with an edge I knew well. "I just wanted to make sure you got home okay yesterday," she said. "I did," I replied. There was a pause. You know, some people were surprised to see you sitting up front. I'm sure they were, I said, keeping my tone even. It's just that, she began, but I didn't let her finish. It's just that I'm family, I said. And I wanted to be near him. That's all. Another pause, longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice was cooler. Well, I suppose it's done now. Yes, I said. It is. After we hung up, I sat there with the phone in my lap, my hands trembling slightly. Not from fear, but from the release of finally saying what I'd been holding back for years. It wasn't a grand speech, but it was mine. That night, I cooked for myself for the first time in days, nothing elaborate, just pasta with garlic and olive oil, and ate it at the table instead of on the couch. It felt like a small reclaiming, like making space for myself in my own life again. I thought about how many times I'd told myself that confrontation wasn't worth it, that peace was better than truth. But peace without truth wasn't peace at all. It was just quiet resentment, folded neatly and tucked away. Before bed, I stood at the window for a long time, looking out at the dark street. The rain had stopped, but the pavement still shone under the streetlights. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. I thought about him, about the sound of his laugh, about the way he used to look at me when I spoke, like every word I said mattered. I realized that was what I'd been chasing all these years without knowing it, not approval, not acceptance, but that simple, steady recognition. And maybe, in some small way, I'd given it back to myself yesterday. The next morning, the sky was pale and streaked with thin clouds, the kind that promised nothing more than a lukewarm sun. I woke before the alarm, which was unusual for me. Sleep had been restless again, broken by odd dreams where I was in a room full of people whose faces I couldn't quite see, all of them speaking in that same low, judgmental hum I'd heard at the funeral. I got up, showered, and made tea, my movements slow, deliberate. The house felt different now, not just quieter, but altered somehow, like the air had shifted. I found myself glancing at the phone, half expecting another call. None came. By mid-morning, I decided to go out. Not to the store this time, but to the old park where he used to take me when I was little. It wasn't far, a 15-minute drive, and I told myself it was just to get fresh air, but I knew there was more to it than that. I wanted to stand in a place where his presence felt unfiltered by anyone else's narrative. The park was mostly empty, just a few dog walkers scattered along the paths. The air was crisp, and the grass was damp underfoot. I followed the familiar curve of the path toward the pond. It looked just as it had decades ago, the water still, the surface broken only by the occasional ripple of a duck gliding past. I stood there, my hands tucked into my coat pockets, remembering how he used to bring stale bread to feed the ducks, always telling me, toss it far so they swim to it, make them work for it. I'd laughed at that, thinking it was just about ducks. Now, older, I wondered if it was his way of teaching me about life without saying so directly. After a while, I sat on one of the old wooden benches. The paint was peeling, and the metal armrests were spotted with rust. I thought about how many conversations we'd had here, about school, about friends, about the small heartbreaks I'd thought were the end of the world back then. He never dismissed my worries, even the small ones. That was something rare, I realized. I stayed there for nearly an hour before I finally stood and made my way back to the car. As I drove, I found myself taking the long way home, passing through streets we used to walk together. The houses had changed, new paint, new fences, but the layout was the same. It was strange how a place could stay familiar even after so much time had passed. When I got home, there was an envelope in the mailbox. My name written on the front in a neat, unfamiliar hand. No return address. Inside was a short note. I saw you at the funeral. I don't know if you remember me, but I wanted to say that I was glad you sat where you did. He would have wanted you there. There was no signature, just that. I read it 3 times, my chest tightening a little more with each read. I couldn't place the handwriting. It might have been a distant relative, or maybe someone outside the family entirely. But the anonymity didn't matter. What mattered was that someone else had seen, really seen, what I was doing. I tucked the note into the box from the closet, between the scarf and the concert ticket. It felt right for it to live there, among the pieces of him I'd kept. The afternoon drifted by in quiet. I made soup, the kind he'd liked, carrots, potatoes, leeks, and ate it with thick slices of bread. It was comforting in a way I hadn't expected. After lunch, I sat at the table with my notebook, one I hadn't touched in months. I used to write in it often, thoughts, memories, scraps of conversations I didn't want to lose, but somewhere along the way, I'd stopped. I opened it now and began to write about the funeral, about the seat, about the way the air had felt heavy but my chest had felt light when I sat down. The words came slowly at first, then faster, until I was spilling them onto the page without thinking about how they'd sound to anyone else. By the time I looked up, the light outside had shifted to that late afternoon gold that makes everything feel softer. I set the pen down and stretched, feeling an ache in my shoulders that was almost satisfying, the ache of having done something that mattered, even if only to me. That evening, the phone rang again. This time, it was my younger cousin, the one I'd barely spoken to in years. Her voice was tentative. I just wanted to say, "I think you were brave yesterday," she said. I didn't know what to say at first. "Thank you," I managed. "I don't know if I could have done it," she went on. "Everyone's always so careful about not stepping out of line." "I was careful for a long time," I said. "It didn't get me anywhere worth being." There was a pause, and then she said, "I miss him too." Her voice cracked just a little, and I felt something in me loosen. We talked for a while after that, not about the others, not about the politics of family seating arrangements, but about him. About the way he used to sing badly on purpose to make us laugh. About the time he tried to fix the leaky roof and fell halfway through, swearing like the sky was listening. We laughed, and it felt strange but good. After we hung up, I realized I'd been smiling. Not because anything had been fixed, nothing like that, but because it felt like a small bridge had been built over the gap between me and at least one person. That night, I slept better. My dreams were still restless, but they weren't sharp-edged. I woke to the sound of birds outside, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the smell of rain from the night before. The world was still the same, but it didn't press down on me quite as hard. Over the next few days, I kept noticing little changes in myself. I walked straighter. I didn't avoid the mirror in the hallway anymore. I even caught myself humming once while washing the dishes. I wasn't pretending that one act, sitting in that seat, had solved anything. But it had shifted something fundamental. It was as if I'd finally stepped back into a space I'd been quietly ushered out of years ago. On the fourth day, I went back to the park. This time, I brought bread for the ducks, tossing it far just like he'd told me all those years ago. I watched them paddle toward it, their small wakes rippling out in widening circles. It made me think about how even the smallest action could send something out into the world that kept moving, kept touching other things. And maybe that was what this was, not a grand reclaiming, but a ripple. One I'd started without knowing exactly where it would reach. The next week began with a cold snap. The rain stopped, but the air carried that sharp, almost metallic edge that made your breath visible and your fingers ache if you stayed out too long. I found myself standing by the window more often, watching the world move outside, people in scarves hurrying past, their heads ducked, their steps quick. Inside, life was still quiet, but it no longer felt quite so heavy. I'd begun making a list in my notebook, not of tasks, but of moments. Small things I'd noticed in the days since the funeral. The way the late afternoon light fell across the kitchen floor. The sound of the old clock in the hallway when the house was still. A dream I'd had where I was sitting at that park bench again, only this time, he was beside me, saying nothing, just being there. I didn't know why I was writing them down. Maybe to remind myself that life was still made of these little pieces, even in the shadow of loss. Or maybe to prove to myself that I hadn't gone numb, that I was still noticing things. On Wednesday, the phone rang again. This time, it was my mother. We'd spoken briefly at the funeral, but only in that stilted, surface way people do when they're surrounded by others. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the undercurrent. "I heard you had words with your cousin after the service," she said. I stayed silent for a beat, deciding how much truth to give her. "We spoke," I said eventually. "I'm sure she's told her version." "She said you were firm," my mother said carefully. "That's one word for it." There was another pause. I could picture her in her kitchen, one hand holding the phone, the other probably fiddling with the hem of her sweater like she always did when she wasn't sure how to continue. "You know," she said slowly, "your uncle would have been proud of you for showing up." The words landed heavier than I expected. "You think so?" I asked, my voice quieter now. "I know so," she said, and there was no hesitation this time. He hated all that unspoken politics. He just wanted people there. The right people. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. I felt the sting of tears at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them back. "Thank you," I said finally. After we hung up, I sat at the table for a long while, my tea growing cold in front of me. My mother and I had our own history, not without its silences and careful steps, but that call felt like something, a thread pulled taut between us in a way it hadn't been in years. Later that day, I decided to clear out the spare room. It had been years since I'd done more than shove boxes into it and close the door. As I pulled things out, I came across a stack of old letters bound with twine. They were from him, postcards, birthday cards, little notes he'd left me over the years. I sat on the floor and untied the bundle, running my fingers over the familiar handwriting. Some of the messages were mundane: "Hope the weather's better where you are," or "Don't forget to check the oil in the car." Others were warmer, like the one where he'd written, "You've got more grit than you think. Don't let them tell you otherwise." I read them all, slowly, until the light in the room began to dim. The words felt like a conversation picked up after too long a silence. I placed the letters in a small wooden box I'd found in the closet, one that had once held keepsakes of another kind, and set it on the shelf where I could see it every day. That evening, I cooked again, not just for myself this time. I invited my younger cousin, the one who'd called me after the funeral. She arrived with a bottle of wine and that tentative smile of someone not sure how welcome they truly are. But as we ate, the conversation flowed more easily than I'd expected. We talked about ordinary things: work, the weather, a TV show we'd both been watching, and, slowly, about him. She told me about a conversation she'd had with him a few years back, where he'd told her to stop worrying so much about fitting in with the family, that fitting in wasn't worth shrinking yourself. It struck me how he'd been saying the same thing to both of us, in his own way. Maybe he'd known we'd both need to hear it. After she left, I washed the dishes and stood for a long moment at the sink, looking out at the dark street. The cold air seeped in through the edges of the window frame, and I thought about how much had changed in such a short time, not in the world outside, but in the space I carried inside myself. The next day, I went back to the park again. It had become a kind of ritual, though I hadn't named it as such. This time, I didn't just sit on the bench. I walked the longer path that wound through the trees. The air was sharp, and each breath felt clean. I thought about how grief doesn't move in straight lines, how it circles back, how it sits beside you when you least expect it. But I also thought about how strength grows the same way, not in grand leaps, but in small, repeated choices. When I returned home, there was another envelope in the mailbox. No name, just my address typed neatly. Inside was a photo, one I'd never seen before. It was him, younger, sitting at a picnic table, smiling at whoever had taken the picture. On the back, in the same handwriting as the first note, were the words, "He always saved you a seat." I stood there on the porch, the cold air biting at my fingers, reading the words over and over. My throat felt tight, but in a different way than before. Not from anger or hurt, but from something gentler, a quiet affirmation that I hadn't imagined it, that my place in his life had been real, no matter what anyone else had tried to erase. I brought the photo inside and placed it in the wooden box with the letters. Then I sat at the table and opened my notebook again. I wrote down everything: the park, the letters, the conversation with my mother, the dinner with my cousin, the anonymous photo. I wrote until my hand ached, and even then, I didn't want to stop. It was as if I was piecing something back together, not the past, because that was gone, but the shape of myself that had been worn away over the years. That night, as I got ready for bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror. For the first time in a long time, I didn't look away. There was a steadiness in my eyes I hadn't noticed before, a quiet kind of resolve that didn't need to announce itself. I realized then that sitting in that first seat hadn't been the end of something, it had been the STA. In the days that followed, the quiet in my house began to feel different. It wasn't the oppressive kind anymore, the silence that made you aware of every tick of the clock, every creak of the floorboards. Now it felt like space. Space I could fill with my own choosing, rather than just the echoes of what had been taken from me. I still thought about him every day. But the thoughts had shifted. At first, they'd been edged with that sharp ache, the reminder of absence, of everything left unsaid. Now, they carried something warmer, steadier. I began to remember him not just in the context of loss, but in the thousand ordinary moments that had made up knowing him, the way he used to hum off-key while fixing something, how he'd make a pot of tea without asking because he knew I needed it, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled at me like I was the only person in the room. One afternoon, I decided to go through the last box I hadn't yet touched from the closet. It was tucked behind an old suitcase, and I had to kneel on the floor to pull it out. Inside were things I'd almost forgotten about: a cap from the baseball game we'd gone to when I was 15, a folded paper map from the road trip where we'd gotten hopelessly lost and ended up discovering a lakeside cafe that became our spot, a small carved wooden bird he'd picked up from a market because it looked like it had attitude. Each item was like a door opening to a memory. And with each memory, I felt a little more anchored in the truth of what we'd had, a truth no seating arrangement or whispered instruction could erase. That night, I took the wooden bird and placed it on the shelf by the front door. A small thing, but it made me smile each time I passed it. The following weekend, there was a memorial gathering at my aunt's house. I debated going. Part of me wanted to avoid the sideways glances, the carefully worded comments that passed for conversation in that family. But another part of me, the part that had walked up the aisle and taken the first seat, knew I needed to go. Not to prove anything to them, but to prove something to myself. When I arrived, the house was already full. Coats were piled on the bed in the spare room, and the smell of food and coffee hung in the air. I stepped inside, and the first few people I saw gave me polite smiles, their eyes flicking past me almost immediately. But a few, unexpectedly, came up to speak, small exchanges, nothing profound, but warmer than I'd anticipated. My younger cousin found me by the drinks table. She handed me a glass of water and murmured, "Glad you came." We ended up talking in a corner for nearly an hour, our conversation drifting between light and heavy. I could feel eyes on us from time to time, but I didn't care. At one point, my aunt, the same one who had called me after the funeral with her cool tone, approached. For a moment, I braced myself. But she simply said, "I'm glad you were there that day." I know he would have been. She didn't linger for an answer, just gave a small nod and moved on. It wasn't an apology, exactly, but it was something. Later in the evening, someone suggested we share stories about him. There was a murmur of agreement, and people began offering little memories, some funny, some tender. When it was my turn, I hesitated only for a breath before I spoke. I remember, I began, one summer afternoon when I was about 8. We were sitting on the back steps after he'd fixed my bike, and I asked him if families could stop loving each other. He looked at me like I'd asked the strangest question in the world, and he said, "Not the real kind of love. That never stops." I believed him then. And I believe him now. Even when things get complicated. There was a quiet after I finished, the kind that wasn't awkward but full. Someone cleared their throat. Another person gave a soft laugh, like they were remembering something of their own. When I left that night, the air was cold but clear. The stars were faint, but they were there. As I walked to my car, I realized I wasn't carrying the same weight I had been for so long. It hadn't disappeared, but it had changed shape, from something that pressed me down to something I could hold without breaking. Over the next week, I went to the park again, this time without bread for the ducks. I just sat, letting the winter air sting my cheeks, thinking about how much had shifted since that morning of the funeral. Sitting in that first seat had been a single act, but it had been a hinge, the moment the door swung open to something I'd been missing, my own presence in my life. One afternoon, I found myself writing in my notebook again. I wrote about the park, the anonymous notes, the photo, the wooden bird, the dinner with my cousin. I wrote about how, for so long, I'd measured my place in the family by how much space they allowed me, instead of simply taking the space that was already mine. When I finished, I closed the notebook and placed it on the shelf next to the wooden bird. And then I made tea, the way he used to, strong, with just a little sugar, and sat by the window watching the late light fade. The phone rang once more that evening. It was my younger cousin again, her voice warm. "I found another photo of him," she said. "It's from the lake. Do you want me to bring it over?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. When she arrived, we sat at the table, the photo between us. He was in it, wearing that old baseball cap, grinning at the camera like he was in on a secret. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said quietly, "I'm glad you sat there that day. It made me realize we can choose where we belong." I met her eyes. "We always could," I said. "We just forget sometimes." After she left, I placed the new photo in the wooden box with the others. The box was getting fuller now, and so was something in me. That night, before bed, I stood at the mirror again. I thought about that first moment at the church, the eyes, the whispers, the unspoken rules, and how I had walked past all of it to take my seat. And I realized that the most important thing wasn't that they had seen me do it. It was that I had seen myself do it. As I turned off the light, a line settled in my mind, one I knew I'd carry with me. I hadn't made a scene. I'd made a place. And I was never giving it back.